フランスの歴史がわかる。すごいねー。
During the Ice Age, some folks by the name of the Cro-Magnons inhabited France. They were the first early modern humans to settle into Europe. Centuries later, a tribe called the Gauls came in and built a whole range of communities. However, a rivalry ensued between them and the Romans when in 390 BC the Gauls seized and plundered the city of Rome. So naturally, the Romans decided to return the favor. This was life until the Western Roman Empire disintegrated. A group called the Carolingians eventually rose to prominence. Their first king was Pepin the Short. One of the achievements of his father Charlamagne had been his halt of the Islamic advance into Europe, back in 732. Pepin himself achieved a lot, but his greatest achievement would be the birth of his son, Charlamagne. In 800 AD, Charlamagne was crowned emperor. He had united most of Europe under his rule by the power of the sword. He placed great importance and value on education and culture, thereby reviving art and learning, which had an impact even centuries later on the European continent. This was called the Carolingian Renaissance. He was also a family man, being a devoted father to his many children. In 814, Charlamagne fell ill with a fever after bathing in his warm springs. He died 1 week later, ending his reign of more than 4 decades. In 1066, Duke William, also known as William the Conqueror, was appointed as King of England. However, this meant that he was essentially the King of England and the Duke of Normandy. This was controversial because he was fundamentally the subordinate to a French king, yet as a King of England, also the French king's equal. Two titles were very problematic. This and disputed territorial and dynastic claims between the two nations began the 100 Years' War. The English won a battle in 1340 and again in 1346. Then in 1348, both nations were devastated by the Black Death, which killed about a third of France's population. Thereafter, England won another battle while also managing to capture a French king in 1358. Then a peace treaty was signed where France would have to give up a lot of its territory. Despite this, war resumed in 1369. But in 1378, France finally won a battle and drove the English back. But the English were victorious again in Agincourt in 1415. Things were not looking good for France until one young girl would become a catalyst for a French revival. Born in 1412 to a farmer and his wife in a village named Domremy, Joan of Arc was not your average teenage girl. She was a peasant. She claimed from the age of 13 that she heard voices and later wore men's clothing. She believed that by listening to these voices she was acting under divine guidance. She persuaded the French king to rally the troops and proceeded to inspire their victory at the Battle of Orleans in 1429. However, she was betrayed, handed to the English, and then placed in a prison cell, awaiting her execution. She was found guilty of cross-dressing and heresy. At the age of 19, the English burned her as a heretic in 1431. However, the fight back proceeded, and for the most part, the English were driven out of France. The Maid of Orleans had succeeded. The defeat of England brought back French kings' control of Aquitaine, Normandy, and Burgundy. France was, by the end of the 15th century, a strongly centralized kingdom. Eventually, Catholicism was sustained as the established religion of France, but religious tolerance was granted to the French Protestants. Poor harvests and wars marked a troubled 16th century for France. During King Louis XIV's reign, art and literature flourished, but he involved France in a lot of costly wars and revoked the law that gave Protestants religious toleration. Rationalist thinkers like Voltaire denounced the power of the Catholic Church as well as the traditional laws of the government. Many educated people, including Voltaire, were also influenced by the example of England. Voltaire even visited England and wrote favorably of it. It was an idealized view of England. However, England had a parliament, imprisonment without trial was illegal, and Protestant churches were tolerated. During this time, France ended up losing its stake in Canada and India. In 1776, British forces in North America rebelled, so to get revenge on the British, France helped the Americans win in Yorkshire against the British in the American Revolution. These wars were costly for France and loans were difficult to pay, so they raised taxes. This and the resentment against the system of privileges and tax exemptions enjoyed by the nobility and clergy meant a revolution was arising. Famine was also close. People were in an ugly mood. The commoners were poor, and the nobles were comfortable. A meeting of the Estates General was called by Louis XVI. It consisted of the First Estate, the clergy, the Second Estate, the nobles, and the Third Estate, which comprised of everyone else. The Third Estate started its own National Assembly. King Louis tried to stop them, of course, but they just found another location, and there they placed the Tennis Court Oath, which was an act of defiance that marked the beginning of the French Revolution. The violence began when the Bastille was seized to free prisoners and obtain guns. Eventually, on August 26th, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens was proclaimed. A rumor started that Marie Antoinette was hoarding grain in the palace. Afterwards, a march of armed peasant women occurred that demanded that Louis and Marie move from Versailles to Paris. It was in Austria and Prussia's best interests to restore the French monarchy and discourage the revolution, therefore they intervened. But France decided to invade Austria. But Prussia joined this fight against the French, and Louis XVI seemed to encourage them, which made him look like he was conspiring with foreign powers against the revolution, which led to the Assembly suspending the monarchy and having new elections in which men could vote and create a new republican constitution. There was a trial for Louis, and he was guilty with one vote and was sentenced to die by guillotine. Therefore, Austria and Prussia could not restore him to the throne. Then the terror began. If you could kill the king, then you could kill anyone. Jean-Paul Marat was a journalist and politician who, because of a mysterious disease, had to spend most of his days in a bathtub and was also a vocal radical voice. He was killed by a woman named Charlotte Chaudet, who plunged a kitchen knife into his chest in 1793, just months before the Reign of Terror. Shortly after the terror commenced, the Committee of Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, began guillotining everyone under the sun whom they suspected were enemies of the revolution, which added up to about 17,000 people, with about 10,000 dying in prison or without trial. Marie Antoinette shortly became one of the victims when she was executed, whilst reportedly displaying the same dignity and courage as her husband on the 16th of October 1793. Later, Robespierre himself was also guillotined. After the Terror, a new constitution came in favoring the rich. They were still at war with Prussia and Australia, but they ended up winning thanks to a young Napoleon Bonaparte. His military prowess earned him the first consul of France, which gave him almost unlimited executive power. The revolution was over. Napoleon was consul for 10 years, then in 1804 he crowned himself emperor. He kept some of the achievements of the French Revolution, such as equality before the law. Careers were open to anyone and there was no return to privileged nobility. However, he introduced censorship of the press, reduced women's rights, and even imprisonment without trial. He was a bright student who attended a military school in Brienne. Later, his military genius would allow him to dominate Europe. He was defeated at Trafalgar in October 1805, ending his hopes of conquering Britain. However, he was still at his peak. Things only began to go wrong in 1812 when Napoleon's invasion of Russia ended in disaster. Then Prussia, Austria, and Sweden joined in on the war against France in the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813. Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to an island named Elba. In 1815, he returned to France and was welcomed by the people, but he was ultimately defeated again at Waterloo in a really concerted effort by the rest of Europe. This time he was exiled to a more remote island named St. Helena to live out the rest of his days. A man who once had the world was left with the sea. Napoleon was replaced by Louis XVIII. He allowed France a constitution. When he died in 1824, his brother Charles X became king. Under him, the French invaded Algeria, which took many years, but he also provoked an uprising in 1830 and was forced to abdicate. Then the Industrial Revolution began to change France, and people lived and worked in horrible conditions. In February 1848, a demonstration was held in Paris. Soldiers fired on demonstrators and triggered a revolution. In November, the new constitution was published, all men were allowed to vote, and Louis Napoleon, who was Napoleon's nephew, was elected president. He made himself Emperor Napoleon III. Napoleon III had succeeded in rebuilding Paris, but had a bad foreign policy and was throwing money at useless wars. He was losing popularity, so he relaxed press censorship and workers were given the right to strike. Then the French were defeated by Prussia, and Napoleon later fled abroad. Though victorious in the First World War, France suffered the large human and material losses and emerged at the end of 1918 determined to keep Germany weak through systems of alliances and defenses. Despite this effort, France were defeated by Nazi Germany in World War II. The Nazis occupied Paris and France was divided into an occupied north and an unoccupied south. 4 years later, Allied armies liberated France in 1944 and a provincial government was established headed by Charles de Gaulle, the wartime leader of Free France. He later resigned, and then France began to promote international cooperation by joining NATO and then later the EU. Afterwards, France struggled with challenging independence struggles in some of their colonies such as Vietnam and Algeria. After a long civil war, Algeria became independent in 1962. Many of these former colonies maintain close economic and cultural ties with France today.